Nobody had told Winifred Crale that her daughter was coming on a Tuesday. Sandra had a key. She had held it since Dennis died in case of emergencies, and she had used it that Tuesday morning to let herself in before Winifred was properly dressed, and by the time Winifred came downstairs, the care home brochures were already on the coffee table, and Keith was already sitting in the chair by the window. The laundry on Marsh Lane had been empty since 1972. 50 years of a locked door and a service lane that nobody used anymore, and a copper boiler that had not been lit in half a century. Winifred had 60 pounds left when she found the notice. She walked to Marsh Lane anyway. What was hidden beneath the counter of that laundry, inside an oilcloth parcel that should not have been there, connected Winifred to a woman she had loved and a life she had not known was waiting for her. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Winifred Crale had learned to mend things before she learned to read. Her Aunt Dorothy had taught her. Dorothy Birch had run an invisible mending service from the back room of a dry cleaner's on Dunmore Wharf's Market Street from 1954 until she died in 1989, 35 years of reweaving damaged wool and silk and linen so completely that the damage ceased to exist. Not patched, not disguised, gone. The thread worked back into the weave thread by thread until the fabric was whole again, and the eye could find no evidence that it had ever been otherwise. Dorothy had started teaching Winifred on Saturday afternoons when Winifred was 7 years old. By the time Winifred was 12, she could repair a wool weave so that Dorothy could not find the join. By the time she was 20, she had the full range of the technique. Every weave structure Dorothy knew, every thread gauge, every approach to silk that was different from wool and different again from linen. And then Winifred had gone to work at the cotton mill on Fenwick Street because that was what you did, and then the mill had closed and she had gone into supermarket back-office work for 20 years, and Dorothy had died and left her the needle case and the knowledge and no premises to practice in, except the sitting-room table in the evenings. She had taken small commissions her whole adult life. Word of mouth, quietly, neighbors and the neighbors of neighbors who knew to ask. A moth hole in a good coat, a cigarette burn in a wool skirt from the 1960s, a fraying section in a piece of antique linen that a woman had inherited from her grandmother and could not bring herself to throw away. Winifred charged modest amounts and turned down nothing she could repair. Dennis had understood that the sitting-room table was not a hobby. He had left it alone. He had come home on evenings when Winifred was mid-commission and made his own supper without comment, understanding instinctively that you did not interrupt a person when their hands were doing something that required that level of attention. He had been gone 4 years, and she had continued at the table in the evenings because she had not found a reason to stop and because the mending was one of the few things that had not changed shape after he died. The needle case was in the pocket of her cardigan. It was always in the pocket of her cardigan. A small steel cylinder, approximately 3 inches long, with a screw cap at one end, the outside engraved with the initials D.B. in a script that was ornate for the period. 12 needles of different gauges inside, inherited from Dorothy, along with everything else Dorothy had known. Winifred had never replaced a single one. Sandra had been planning this for most of the previous year. Winifred understood this later, when she had the distance to see the shape of it. The conversations about the house being too large, the remarks about the boiler, the questions about whether Winifred was managing the stairs that Winifred had answered honestly and that Sandra had apparently processed as evidence for a conclusion she had already reached. Sandra was 49. She worked in HR. She was good at presenting decisions as outcomes, at making the inevitable sound inevitable rather than chosen. She had a husband named Graham, who had strong opinions about sensible arrangements, and who had been a background presence in all of this, Winifred suspected, in the way that certain husbands are background presences in things they have in fact arranged. Keith was 46. He was Sandra's younger brother. He had not initiated this. He had been told about it and had come because Sandra had asked him to, and because he was the kind of man who came when asked without examining too closely whether he should. He sat in the chair by the window, and he did not look at Winifred directly, and he turned the teaspoon over and over in his fingers, end over end, in a rhythm that was not quite regular, as if the turning was keeping something in him managed. Sandra explained the assessment that the housing team had done. The flat that had been identified in the sheltered complex on Birch Road, very well reviewed, a warden on site 4 days a week. The practical logic of it, the size of the house, the heating costs, the stairs, the fact that there was no one nearby in an emergency. Winifred let her finish. Then she said, "This is my house, Sandra." Sandra said it was a rented house, and the tenancy review was coming, and that the housing association had been in contact, and that the sheltered flat would actually be more secure because it was a lifetime tenancy. Winifred said, "I did not ask to be more secure. I asked to be left alone." Sandra said that was not really possible anymore. When Winifred stood up, Keith's teaspoon turning accelerated. End over end, faster, the small steel catching the light. He did not look at it. He did not look at Winifred. He did not speak. Winifred took the needle case from her cardigan pocket and transferred it to her coat pocket, which was hanging on the back of the door. She did not take it out to examine it or hold it. She simply moved it from one pocket to the other. Then she sat back down because there was nowhere to go yet, and she was not going to leave her own sitting room. She began making arrangements the next day. It took 6 weeks to find anything she could afford, and what she found was a single room in a house on the Ring Road with 3 other occupants, 2 of whom worked nights and 1 of whom played music in the afternoons. £45 a week, shared bathroom, a kitchen she could use between 7 and 9 in the morning and after 6 in the evening. The room was too small for the mending table, which she had left behind in the house, because there had been no way to move it, and Sandra had said she would keep it safe, a phrase that in context meant something different from what it said. Winifred worked in the evenings on her lap with a hardback book underneath the fabric, which was not correct, but was better than nothing. She completed 2 small commissions this way and was paid for both of them, and the money helped and was not enough. She had been there for 8 weeks when the money ran to £60. £60, a pension that did not stretch far enough, and a needle case in her coat pocket with 12 needles and 35 years of knowledge behind every one of them. She had gone to the community center on a Wednesday afternoon, not for any particular purpose, because the room in the Ring Road house was too small to sit in for extended periods without becoming a problem, and because the community center had chairs and newspapers and did not require her to buy anything. On the notice board in the corridor outside the main hall, there was a sheet from the council's assets disposal office tucked behind a poster for a yoga class describing a rural and small commercial property disposal batch. It was the wrong region's batch. It had been put up in the wrong location, or perhaps taken from one board and moved to another by accident, and it listed properties in the coastal and estuarial districts rather than the inland ones. Winifred read it because she read everything on community center notice boards, having nowhere else to be, and at the bottom of the 3rd column there was a listing for a former commercial laundry on Marsh Lane, Dunmore Wharf, vacant since approximately 1972, building described as a single-story brick structure in partial disrepair, of limited commercial interest given size and location, available under the Estuarial Small Assets Disposal Program. The asking price, with a structured payment arrangement available, was £3,100. Winifred read it 3 times. She knew Marsh Lane. She had passed it on the bus to Dorothy's every Saturday for years. She had not known there was a laundry there. She had been a child and then a teenager, and she had not been looking for laundries. But she knew the lane, and she knew approximately where it was, and she knew the kind of building the listing was describing. She asked the woman at the community center desk if she could use the phone. The council's assets disposal office took 3 calls across 2 days to reach anyone who could tell her anything, and what they told her was that the listing was current, that the property had been on the disposal list for over a year without interest, and that the payment structure was available to individuals with a demonstrable business use plan. Winifred asked what constituted a demonstrable business use plan. The man on the phone said a letter would do to start with. She wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table between 7 and 9. She described Dorothy's service and her own training and the commissions she had taken for 30 years and the absence of any suitable commercial premises for this type of work in the Dunmore Wharf area. She described the textile and the technique at the level of someone who had been doing it for decades, which is the level at which it sounds entirely serious. She sent it the next morning. 3 weeks later, she signed the papers. Marsh Lane was a narrow service passage running behind the terraced houses on the east side of the Market Street, wide enough for a handcart but not a modern van. The laundry was the only commercial building on it, a single-story brick structure with a plain wooden door at the front and a metal service entrance at the side. The sign above the door had been painted over, but the ghost of lettering was still readable under the white. Marsh Lane Laundry, established 1948. Winifred stood in front of the door for a moment. Then she put her key in the lock. The interior was dim and cold and smelled of 50 years of disuse, overlaid on the deeper smell of the work that had been done here. Hot water and soap, and the particular clean exhaustion of wet linen dried in warm air. The smell had gone so deep into the brick and plaster that it was structural. It would never leave. The tiled sorting room at the front was intact. The tiles were a cream and dark green pattern that would have been practical in 1948 and had outlasted everything around it. Some were cracked, but none were missing. The wooden counter along the left-hand wall was solid, its surface worn smooth at the customer-facing edge from decades of bundles being set down and collected. Worn in the specific place that decades of a single repeated gesture produces, the edge darker and softer than the rest. Beyond the sorting room, the main working space. The copper boiler against the far wall, enormous, its surface green with oxidation, but its form completely intact. And above the workbenches, still hanging on their ceiling rails after 50 years of nobody using them, the original wooden drying racks, perhaps 12 of them, each one a slatted wooden frame on a pulley system that allowed them to be raised and lowered. They hung at mid-height, dusty, motionless, completely present. Winifred stood beneath them and looked up. She did not touch them. She did not assess them for removal or retention. She simply looked at them, and then she went to examine the copper boiler, because that was the most pressing structural question, and the drying racks stayed where they were. The floor of the back room was the problem. A section near the rear wall had partially given way. The boards rotted through from below, a dip in the floor that became a gap at the worst point, the ground visible beneath. It was not safe to walk on. It was the first thing that needed addressing, and it was beyond what Winifred could do alone. The rest she could begin. She set up the work table in the sorting room beneath the drying racks, a folding table she brought in her shopping trolley, and she unpacked her equipment. The needle case, the thread collection she had been building for 20 years, organized by fiber and weight in a series of small paper envelopes, the magnifying stand her optician had recommended for close work, the daylight lamp that was the most important single tool in the kit. She turned on the lamp and sat down at the table and took out a piece of damaged wool she had been carrying in her bag since before Dennis died, a commission she had not completed because the client had stopped pressing and life had intervened. She threaded the finest needle from the case and held the fabric under the lamp and began. The work was the same in this room as it had been at the sitting-room table in the evenings. The same attention, the same patience, the same requirement to hold the fabric at the angle that showed the weave structure clearly and read it correctly before the first thread was placed. But in this room, with the drying racks above her and the copper boiler behind the wall and the smell of a working laundry, 50 years gone still present in the brickwork, it felt different, not easier, simply more itself. She had been there 4 days when she went to find Renata. She needed trade suppliers for specialist mending thread. The gauge and fiber content required for invisible mending work was not available at retail level, had not been for years. The suppliers who stocked it sold to commercial textile operations and dry cleaning businesses and the occasional specialist restorer, and none of them were accessible through the usual channels. She tried 3 shops on the market street. All 3 told her variations of the same thing. They did not carry it, did not know who did, suggested she try online. Winifred did not use the internet with the fluency required to navigate specialist trade suppliers. The 4th door was Renata's. Renata's alterations and dry cleaning, the sign read, and the window display was the window display of someone who understood their trade. A tailored jacket repaired at the shoulder so precisely the damage was invisible, a length of fabric demonstrating the difference between a bad dye match and a correct one. Winifred opened the door. Renata Kowalczyk was 64. She had been operating from these premises for 30 years. She was behind the counter when Winifred came in, working at a sewing machine with the concentration of someone who did not enjoy being interrupted, but who would not say so. She was compact and direct, and looked at Winifred with the expression of someone assessing a job before quoting for it. Winifred explained what she was looking for: the thread, the gauge, the fiber content. Renata said, "I do not deal with individuals. The suppliers I use have minimum order requirements." Winifred said, "I am not an individual. I am a specialist restorer. I have been working at Marsh Lane Laundry for 4 days." Renata looked at her for a moment. She said, "Nobody has been at Marsh Lane Laundry for 50 years. Winifred said, "I know." There was a pause. Then Winifred took the needle case from her coat pocket and set it on the counter. She unscrewed the cap and tilted it so the needles fanned slightly, allowing the different gauges to be visible. Renata looked at the needles. She came closer. She looked at them the way someone looks at something they have professional knowledge of, which is differently from how most people look at most things. She said, "What is the gauge on the 3rd one?" Winifred told her. Renata said, "And the 6th?" Winifred told her. Renata was quiet for a moment. She picked up the needle case and looked at the engraving. "DB," she said. "Where did you get this?" Winifred said, "Dorothy Birch. She was my aunt. She ran a mending service on the market street from 1954. Renata set the case down carefully. She said, "I know that name. My mother brought things to her." The silence in the alterations shop had the same quality as the silence on the access track with Glynn, the quality of 2 people standing in the fact of someone who is gone. Winifred recognized it. Renata said, "I will ring the supplier on Thursday. You will need to open a trade account." Winifred said, "Thank you." Renata said, "Do not thank me yet. They are very particular." She came to the laundry the following Thursday, not with the thread, which was still being sorted through the supplier, but to look at the copper boiler, which she said her brother-in-law might be able to assess. She looked at the sorting room and the drying racks, and did not say anything about either of them, but she came back the following week with her brother-in-law, and she had been coming every Thursday since. Crispin Okafor arrived in the 2nd week. The housing support team had sent him with a reference and a single hold-all, and the careful expression of a man who has been in worse situations and is not going to pretend this one is fine until he understands what it is. He was 69, former hospital porter, 22 years at the Dunmore Wharf General before the department was restructured and the post disappeared. His landlord had converted the building where he lived to short-term holiday lets, and the tenants had been given notice in March. He had been in the housing system since April. He looked at the laundry without comment for about 10 minutes. Then he said, "The boiler." Winifred said, "What about it?" He said, "It is a Cornish boiler. You do not see them outside industrial installations anymore. It is not as damaged as it looks." Winifred said, "Can it be restored?" He said, "I do not know yet." He went to the boiler and spent an hour examining it, running his hands over the oxidized copper, checking the flue connection at the top, the draw valve at the base, the seam welds along the body. He had no particular expertise with copper boilers. He had 22 years of expertise with large institutional systems that behaved badly and needed understanding before they would cooperate, which was effectively the same thing. He asked Winifred if he could come back the next day. She said yes. He was there every day after that. His conflict was in the 3rd week. He had assessed the rotted floor section in the back room and had told Winifred plainly that the joists beneath were compromised over a wider area than the visible damage suggested, and that the safe thing to do was to close off the back room entirely until a full floor replacement could be done. Winifred said she could not afford a full floor replacement. Crispin said the alternative was someone going through the floor, and that was not a risk he was willing to accept. They disagreed for 2 days. Crispin was not wrong about the structural risk, and Winifred knew it. The resolution was Crispin sourcing reclaimed joists from a salvage yard and spending the following weekend replacing the compromised section himself with the help of a man he knew from the housing shelter, and the floor being safe to use by the Monday. He had not waited for agreement. He had waited for Winifred to stop arguing, and then he had done what needed doing. Winifred did not thank him. She moved her equipment into the back room where the light was better and said nothing about the floor. Abena Asante arrived in the 3rd week. She was 38, a professional seamstress who had operated her own alterations and bespoke workshop from a studio in the Dunmore Wharf Creative Quarter for 6 years, until the building was sold to a developer and the tenants given 12 weeks. Her clients had been redirected to other workshops. She had been doing commission work from her kitchen table for 3 months, and it was not enough. She had heard about the laundry through a network of seamstresses and textile workers who maintained contact via a group message thread that Winifred did not know existed. The message had said, "Someone is doing invisible mending at the old Marsh Lane laundry," and Abena had read it and thought, "I should see this." She was not immediately easy to accommodate. She had her own professional standards and her own methods, and she did not naturally operate as someone else's assistant. The 1st week was an extended negotiation conducted entirely through the medium of practical work, each of them demonstrating their approach on different tasks and watching the other and saying very little. The clash came in the 2nd week over thread tension. Abena's method for securing a repair at the edge of a weave was different from Winifred's, and she said so directly. Winifred said her method had been correct for 40 years, and she was not going to change it. Abena said that Winifred's method was correct for period textiles and less correct for modern synthetics, and that if they were going to take any commission that came in rather than only period work, they needed both approaches. Winifred thought about this. She said, "Show me." Abena showed her. Winifred watched. She did not change her method. She accepted that Abena's method had its domain. After that, they worked in the same room with the productive ease of two people who have located the boundary between their expertise and stopped arguing about it. Abina's near departure came in the 8th week, when her former studio manager offered her a position in a well-run conventional alterations shop on the north side of town. Regular hours, proper equipment, reliable income. Abina told Winifred about it without asking for anything. Winifred said, "What do you want to do?" Abina said she did not know. She said, "The work here is more interesting." Winifred said, "It will become more reliable, but it will take time." Abina sat with that for several days. Then she told the studio manager no. She did not explain her reasoning to Winifred, and Winifred did not ask. Phineas Ajay arrived in the 5th week with a printed CV and a quality of hopeful embarrassment that Winifred found more honest than most of what people presented her with. He was 24. He had a degree in textile design from a college in the north and had been doing parcel delivery work for 8 months because the textile industry's appetite for newly graduated designers was not equal to the number of newly graduated designers, and he had been at the wrong end of that calculation. Winifred looked at the CV. She said, "Your degree is in design." He said, "Yes." She said, "This is repair, not design." He said, "I know the difference." She said, "Do you know how to read a weave structure under a 40 times magnification without a diagram?" He said, "No." She said, "Can you be here tomorrow morning?" He came the next morning and every morning after that. The mismatch between his training and the discipline was real, and Winifred did not minimize it. He knew how fabrics were made, and he knew how they should look, and he had no instinct for how they failed and what failure looked like under magnification and what the correct intervention was. These were things that had to be taught by showing and could not be learned from a diagram. Winifred showed him. The mastery moment came in the 7th week. Winifred had been repairing a section of Victorian wool chalice, a diagonal twill that required a specific approach to maintaining the twill angle through the repair, and when she was finished, she held the fabric up to the daylight lamp and handed it to Phineas. He took it and held it to the light and moved it slowly, looking for the join, the way she had taught him to look. He turned it. He brought it closer. He held it at the angle she had shown him for finding oblique weave repairs. He could not find it. He looked at Winifred with his mouth open and nothing useful to say. Winifred said, "The join is there. You are looking with the wrong part of your eye." He looked again. He still could not find it. He said, "How long did that take you to be able to do?" Winifred thought about Dorothy's Saturday afternoons, about the years at the sitting-room table, about the mill and the supermarket and everything that had happened in between and around and alongside the mending that had nothing to do with it. She said, "Most of a life." He turned the fabric over again, slowly. He said, "I want to be able to do that." Winifred said, "Then come back tomorrow." If you have made it this far into Winifred's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Lottie arrived in the 6th week on a Tuesday after school, delivered by Phineas, who was her nearest available family on Tuesday afternoons, deposited at the laundry door with a school bag and a look on her face that said she had opinions about this arrangement. She was 8 years old. She sat on the bench along the sorting room wall and opened her reading book and was quiet for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she looked up at the drying racks. She said to nobody in particular, "Why are those up there?" Phineas said, "They were always up there." She said, "Can you come down?" He said, "They have a pulley." "Probably." She stood up and went to the nearest rack and found the pulley rope and pulled it carefully, the way someone pulls something they are not sure of. The rack descended smoothly, the wooden slats dusty, but the pulley mechanism silent, oiled somehow by 50 years of nothing moving rather than by use. Lottie looked at the rack at waist height in front of her. She pushed it back up. She sat back down with her reading book. The following Tuesday she came in, put her bag on the bench, pulled the rack down, pushed it back up, and sat down. It became the thing she did when she arrived. Not playing, not performing, simply acknowledging the rack. Winifred watched this for 2 weeks and said nothing about it. Nobody said anything about it. In the 3rd week, Winifred hung a finished piece of mending on the rack before sending Phineas to pull it up. She had finished it, and it was ready, and the rack was the right height, and the light from the sorting room window would show it correctly. She hung it without announcement and told Phineas to raise the rack. He raised it. The finished piece hung above the workbench in the warm air from the restored boiler, moving very slightly. Nobody said anything. But after that, the racks became where finished work was hung before collection, the pieces moving gently above the bench, and the decision had never been made. It had simply accumulated, the way certain things accumulate when a building has been waiting long enough for the right use. The discovery had happened in the 2nd week, before Abena or Phineas arrived, when Winifred was examining the wooden counter in the sorting room for signs of the structural weakness that Crispin had suggested might be present in the joinery as well as the floor. She was running her hand along the underside of the counter when she felt the panel at the back of the lower cabinet section shift under her palm. Not loose, not broken. Hinged, she realized, very slightly, as if it had been made to open. She worked it carefully, using a kitchen knife along the edge, and the panel swung inward on a hinge that had been set deliberately rather than structurally, a hidden access point rather than a piece of cabinet joinery. Behind it was a shallow cavity, dry despite everything around it being damp, lined with what appeared to be a layer of waxed paper that had been replaced at some point and had done its job. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth tied with waxed string, a flat parcel. She brought Crispin through from the back room, and they opened it on the workbench under the daylight lamp. The contents were 3 items. The first was a set of cards, perhaps 30 of them, each approximately the size of a postcard, made from heavy stock that had survived the years without significant deterioration. On each card, a repair pattern, not instructions, diagrams, thread-by-thread diagrams showing the weave structure of a specific fabric type and the precise route of the repair thread through it, drawn in 2 different inks, a dark blue and a later brown, as if the cards had been created by one person and annotated by another at a different time. Each card was labeled in the top corner with the fabric type and weave structure it addressed. Winifred held the cards under the lamp and read them one by one. Some of the patterns she knew. Some she had found independently and was using. Several she had never seen, addressing weave structures she had encountered but not resolved to her own satisfaction. She set the cards down on the bench. Crispin said, "What are they?" Winifred said, "They are the complete method. Someone wrote down the complete method." He looked at the cards. He said, "Whose handwriting?" She said she did not know. The dark blue was a neat, careful hand. The brown annotation was different, more hurried, adding notes to the original with a familiarity that suggested the annotator knew the method rather than was learning it. The second item was the receipts ledger, a hardback accounts book, its cover rubbed and water-stained but its pages intact, listing by date and customer name the work received and collected at Marsh Lane Laundry from 1951 to 1972, the final entry dated March of that last year in a hand that had grown less steady as the years progressed. Names and addresses going back more than 2 decades, many of the addresses on streets that still existed. Winifred turned the ledger's pages slowly and did not speak. She turned to the back cover. Inside it, tucked into the fold of the end paper, a small photograph. Black and white, approximately postcard-sized, slightly creased across one corner. Two women standing in front of the laundry door on Marsh Lane, squinting slightly into what must have been bright sunlight, smiling at someone behind the camera. The door behind them had the Marsh Lane laundry sign above it, legible and new in the photograph. One of the women was perhaps 60, broad and capable-looking, wearing a work apron over a dark dress. The other was perhaps 30. Dark-haired, slight, her head turned a fraction toward the camera, as if she had just been called. Her smile, the specific smile of someone who is not performing for the camera, but who is caught in a moment of being happy. Winifred recognized her immediately. She said, "That is Dorothy." Crispin looked at the photograph. He said, "The woman on the right?" Winifred said yes. She held the photograph for a long time. Dorothy at 30, standing in front of a building that Winifred had bought without knowing Dorothy had ever been inside it. Dorothy at 30, which was before Winifred was born, which meant this was from the beginning, from the very start of the service on the Market Street, before Dorothy had her own premises. Dorothy had learned here, or worked here, or both. The older woman in the photograph was perhaps the Marsh Lane Laundry's owner, and the younger woman was Dorothy, and the pattern cards in 2 inks were the original cards and Dorothy's annotations. The method passed from one person to the next in exactly the way it had been passed from Dorothy to Winifred. Winifred set the photograph down beside the cards and the ledger. She said to Crispin, "I need a minute." He went back to the boiler room. She stood at the workbench alone with the 3 items and the daylight lamp and thought about the shape of things, about what gets passed down and how it travels and the distances it crosses that nobody maps at the time, about Dorothy's Saturday afternoons, about the needle case in her coat pocket, 12 needles of different gauges, the initials DB engraved in ornate script. She took the needle case out and set it on the workbench beside the photograph. The 2 of them, the case and the photograph, side by side under the lamp, Dorothy's tool and Dorothy's face, the beginning and the continuation. Winifred screwed the cap back on the needle case and put it in her pocket. Then she went to see how Crispin was getting on with the boiler. The boiler was a 6-month project, as it turned out. Crispin worked on it in the mornings before the sorting room became too busy with Abina and Phineas and the commission work that was steadily increasing, stripping the oxidized surface back methodically and assessing each section before moving to the next. He read about Cornish boilers in the evenings at the library and came back the next morning with specific questions that he worked out through the copper itself rather than through conversation. He said to Winifred one morning, not as a complaint, "I did not know I would end up knowing this much about Victorian industrial heating." Winifred said, "Most skills arrive that way." He looked at her over the boiler casing he was working on. He said, "Is that what happened with the mending?" She said, "It is what happened with everything worth knowing." He thought about that. Then he went back to the boiler. The pattern cards went into protective sleeves and were catalogued by Abena, who had a methodical approach to documentation that Winifred lacked the patience for. Phineas transcribed the handwritten annotations into a typed document that could be read without risking the originals. The ledger was photographed page by page on Phineas's phone, and the images stored where multiple people could access them. Winifred kept the photograph on the workbench, propped against the magnifying stand, Dorothy's face at 30, visible to anyone who came to the table to work or to collect. Several clients asked about it. Winifred told them the story in the abbreviated way she had settled on. The laundry, the cavity, the oilcloth parcel, the photograph inside the ledger. People listened with the same attention they give to stories about what connects to what, about the lines between people that run underground and surface somewhere unexpected. The commissions grew without Winifred advertising. Word of mouth from Renata's network, from Abena's former clients, from the small number of people who knew this type of work was being done at Marsh Lane and told others. Each piece completed correctly produced at least one new enquiry, because people who care about damaged textiles know other people who care about damaged textiles, and they talk about who can help them. Winifred did not seek the growth. She accepted what came and did the work at the pace the work required, and told people who needed faster turnarounds that they should look elsewhere, which some of them did and some of them did not, and the ones who did not were the clients she wanted. The drying racks above the workbench held 2 or 3 finished pieces at any given time, moving gently. The garments from different eras and different materials hanging together in the warm air from the restored boiler. Lottie had made the rack her domain. She knew which pieces were which and when they were due for collection, and she would tell anyone who asked, with the authority of someone who has decided that this information belongs to them, what the piece was and who it was for and when it would be ready. Nobody had given her this role. She had given it to herself. The vindication came quietly, the way Winifred had known it would come if it came at all. A textile conservator from the Regional Museum Service had been sent a Victorian silk shawl by a private collector, a piece of considerable value that had been damaged in storage, a section of the warp threads broken over an area of approximately 3 inches, the silk frayed, and the pattern lost across the damage. The conservator had assessed it as beyond restoration, meaning beyond the restoration techniques available to her, and had said so to the collector. The collector had heard about Winifred through a chain of 3 conversations, each of which had passed the name along in the way that specific names get passed along when someone needs something specific. The shawl arrived at Marsh Lane Laundry by registered post with a letter that described the damage and said, "I have been told you may be able to do something with this." Winifred worked on the shawl for 11 days. The silk required the finest needle in the case, the one she had used perhaps a dozen times in 40 years, and the warp thread color required a blend. She made herself from 3 separate silk threads of different dye lots, mixed to match the specific quality of the Victorian dye, which had faded in a particular direction over 150 years. She held the work under the lamp for a combined total of perhaps 30 hours across the 11 days. When she was finished, she held the shawl to the window light and looked at the repair. She could find it. She would always be able to find it because she knew where to look, but she could only find it because she knew where it was. She sent it back. The conservator received it, examined it, and rang the Marsh Lane number 4 days later. She said, "I have been looking at this for 2 hours, and I cannot find the intervention point." Winifred said, "It is there. It is in the 4th inch from the left selvage, upper third." The conservator was quiet for a moment. She said, "I am going to show this to a colleague." Winifred said, "All right." She showed it to 2 colleagues. Both colleagues asked where the work had been done. Within 3 weeks, Winifred had 4 inquiries from textile conservators and museum costume departments, none of whom used the word extraordinary, but all of whom used language that meant it. No journalist came. No institution made a designation. The work itself had spoken in the only language that mattered to the people it needed to speak to. Keith came on a Monday in November. Winifred arrived at Marsh Lane at 8:30, and the rotted section of the back-room floor had been repaired. She had known it needed proper attention beyond Crispin's initial work, that the section beside the rear wall was still risky, but she had not arranged for it to be done. It had been done, properly, with new timber, fitted correctly, the surface level, and safe. On the workbench there was a note in Keith's handwriting that said, "I should have said something. That is all." Winifred read it twice. She put it in the drawer under the workbench where she kept things she was not ready to throw away. She told nobody about it and did not discuss it. Sandra came 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, with a hired man and a van. Winifred heard the van on Marsh Lane and came out to find them unloading Dennis's workbench from the garage, the long, solid wooden one that Dennis had built himself, the one Sandra had been intending to sell. Sandra did not explain it. She said, "I thought you could use it in the back room." Winifred said, "It will fit." The hired man carried it in with Crispin's help and set it along the wall in the back room where the floor was now repaired. Sandra stood in the sorting room doorway for a moment and looked at the drying racks with the finished pieces hanging on them, and the daylight lamp on the work table and Dorothy's photograph propped against the magnifying stand. She did not say anything about any of it. She said, "I did not know about the mending. I knew you did it, but I did not know it was this." Winifred said, "I know." A silence. Sandra said, "I thought you were lonely, that was all." Winifred looked at her daughter. She said, "I was, but I was not only that." Sandra said she would come again. Winifred said the laundry was open 6 days a week. Sandra nodded and went out to the hired man, and they drove away in the van. It was not resolved. It was not entirely open. It was what it was, which was two women who had hurt each other in different ways and who were attempting, in the specific, imprecise manner available to them, to be in the same world again. The laundry ran. Crispin had the boiler operational by December, the first time it had held heat since 1972, and the sorting room was warm for the first time in the building's recent memory. Abina worked from the table in the back room on the commission alterations that paid reliably. Phineas sat beside Winifred at the sorting room table each morning, learning to read damaged weaves under the lamp, getting better at the speed he was getting better at, rather than the speed he wanted to be getting better at. Lottie came on Tuesdays, pulled the rack down and pushed it back up, checked the pieces in progress, told Winifred what was whose. The pattern cards were in their protective sleeves in the cabinet beneath the counter, the oilcloth parcel beside them. The ledger was in the archive box on the shelf, its pages photographed and catalogued. Dorothy's photograph was on the workbench. It would stay there. On an evening in late winter, Winifred was alone at the sorting room table with the daylight lamp on, a commission piece in progress, the needle case beside her hand on the table. The boiler was on and the room was warm. Above her, the finished pieces on the drying racks moved very gently in the heated air, 3 of them, their different fibers catching the lamplight in different ways. She held the piece she was working on up to the lamp and turned it slowly, reading the repair she had just completed. She could find it. She would always be able to find it. But she could only find it because she knew where it was. She set it down and reached for the needle case and held it in her right hand, the weight of it familiar and specific, the engraved initials under her thumb. She thought about Dorothy at 30 in the photograph, standing in the sunlight outside this door. She thought about the woman beside Dorothy, the woman who had made the first pattern cards in dark blue ink, whose name Winifred did not know, and might never know, but whose method had passed through Dorothy to Winifred, and was alive now in this room in the hands of a 24-year-old who could not yet find the join, but who was coming back tomorrow. She set the needle case beside the piece in progress on the table. She turned back to the work. Some repairs you do not know you are making until they are finished. Some things come to you across the distance of a life, and you accept them the way you accept any gift that arrives late, without complaint, with the gratitude that comes from knowing how close you came to never finding it at all. Winifred Crale had found it, at 73, at a folding table under a daylight lamp, in a building that smelled of 50 years of nothing and 100 years of something, with Dorothy's needles in a case beside her hand. She had found it, and it was enough. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, tell us in the comments. Whose handwriting do you think made the first cards in dark blue ink, and do you think Dorothy knew? And if you know someone who has been told at 73 that the useful part of their life is behind them, send this to them today. We are grateful for every one of you who is still here at the end. We will see you in the next one.